It was February 1964. Daytona Beach was loud that morning, not just with engines, but with something else. Pride, ego, rivalry. Because parked on pit road were two very different visions of American power. On one side, the polished, carefully engineered machines from General Motors. And on the other, something brutal, experimental. A cast-iron monster built by Ford Motor Company. Most people remember the muscle car wars of the late 60s. But what almost nobody knows is that the real war didn't start with a car. It started with an engine. And what happened next changed everything. Because by 1963, GM was quietly dominating American performance. The Corvette's 327 cubic inch small block was already making 360 horsepower in fuel-injected trim. Chevrolet's racing programs were producing engines that could run flat out for 500 miles without breaking a sweat. Their engineering was refined, proven, consistent. Pontiac had the 421. Oldsmobile had the rocket engines. Buick was experimenting with the nailhead. GM's divisions were practically competing with each other, let alone the rest of Detroit. Ford? They were tired of losing. So they built something insane. It was called the 427 FE. Now on paper, it sounded simple. A big block V8 with a 4.23-inch bore and a 3.78-inch stroke, giving it a total displacement of 427 cubic inches. But that bore size was pushed right to the absolute limit of the casting. Go any bigger, and the cylinder walls would literally crack under pressure. The block casting had minimal wall thickness between cylinders. Engineers called it Siamese. The cylinders were so close together they nearly touched. Compression ratio? 12.5 to 1. Horsepower in street trim? Around 410. But in race configuration, with dual Holley 4 barrels and open headers, engineers were seeing over 520 horsepower on the dyno. Some experimental versions with wilder camshafts were pushing 550, numbers that made GM's racing engineers nervous. And torque? A monstrous 480 pound-feet that didn't just win races, it destroyed transmissions. The FE family of engines had been around since 1958, but this was different. This was Ford's nuclear option. This was their answer to everything GM had thrown at them for the past decade. They'd taken the basic FE architecture and pushed it to the absolute bleeding edge of what cast iron could handle. But there was a problem. At 6,500 revolutions per minute, the oil pressure dropped like a rock. Bearings overheated. Metal shavings filled the oil pan. One mechanic later said, "The crank journals looked like someone took a blowtorch to them." And Ford had just entered NASCAR with this thing. At the 1964 Daytona 500, driver Fred Lorenzen's Galaxy was fast, really fast. On the straights, it was hitting over 180 miles per hour, unheard of for a full-size stock car. In qualifying, Lorenzen had set times that shouldn't have been possible for something weighing over 3,800 pounds. The Ford was pulling away from Chevrolet Impalas and Pontiac Catalinas like they were standing still. But on lap 47, oil pressure vanished. Moments later, the engine seized. Smoke poured out across turn 3. The race was over. Lorenzen coasted to pit road with a motor that would never run again. When they tore it down later, the main bearings had completely disintegrated. And it wasn't the only one. Across the field, Ford's new 427s were failing in the exact same way. Same RPM range. Same bearing damage. Same catastrophic shutdown. Out of the 11 Ford-powered cars that started the race, only 3 finished. And none of them won. GM-backed teams took the victory. Again. So what do you do when your masterpiece keeps dying in public? You tear it apart. Back in Dearborn, engineers discovered the fatal flaw. The FE's oiling system was feeding the top end first, the camshaft and valve train, before sending oil down to the crankshaft. The main oil gallery ran up through the block to the lifter valley, supplying oil to the rockers and pushrods. Then, whatever was left trickled down to the main bearings, which meant at high RPM, the crank was literally starving. The valve train was gulping down all the oil pressure. By the time anything reached the crankshaft, there wasn't enough volume or pressure to maintain the hydrodynamic film between the bearings and journals. Metal contacted metal. Heat spiked, and failure followed within minutes. And once the crank loses lubrication, game over. So Ford did something radical. They cast an entirely new oil passage down the side of the block. A massive, dedicated gallery that sent oil directly to the main bearings first and everything else second. It required completely new core castings, new tooling, essentially a different engine block. They called it the side oiler. Simple, brutal, effective. The oil pump now fed a large passage running down the driver's side of the block, delivering pressurized oil directly to each main bearing before anything else got a drop. Only after the crank was lubricated did oil route up to the lifters and rockers. Priority reversed. Problem solved. By mid-1965, the new 427 side oiler was ready. And this time, it didn't break. At the 1965 Daytona 500, Ford-powered cars dominated qualifying. Lorenzen's Galaxy ran lap times nearly 2 seconds faster than GM-backed rivals. Down the backstretch, the big FE engines were pulling hard past 7,000 revolutions per minute without losing pressure. Oil pressure gauges held steady even during sustained high RPM runs. The engines that had died so publicly just a year earlier were now bulletproof. One crew chief reportedly told Ford engineers, "Whatever you did, don't touch it again." But the real turning point came a year later. Le Mans. Now officially, GM wasn't racing there. Their corporate racing ban meant Chevrolet had pulled out of factory-backed motorsport in 1963. The AMA agreement, the Automobile Manufacturers Association's supposed ban on racing support, meant GM couldn't officially compete. Unofficially, they were everywhere. Privateer teams were running Corvette-derived engines across endurance racing circuits, pushing small-block V8s to their limits. Jim Hull's chaparrals, Roger Penske's operations. Everyone knew where the engineering support really came from. Ford knew exactly what that meant. So in 1966, they put the 427 side oiler into the GT40 Mk II. Same 4.23-inch bore, same 3.78-inch stroke, but now running endurance-tuned compression closer to 11.0 to 1 for reliability. Lower compression meant less stress, less heat, better survival over 24 brutal hours. Output, about 485 horsepower. And more importantly, it could survive for 24 hours. At full throttle, driver Ken Miles later said, "That engine never complained. It just kept pulling, lap after lap, hour after hour, through the night and into the morning." The FE engines in those GT40s ran at sustained RPM that would have destroyed the earlier center oiler versions within an hour. Down the Mulsanne Straight, the GT40s were exceeding 200 miles per hour, average speed across the full 24-hour race. Over 130 miles per hour, 3,009 miles driven. At the finish line, Ford took first, second, and third. Every single GT40 was running a 427 FE, and not one of them blew an engine. Not one lost oil pressure. Not one suffered bearing failure. The exact problem that had plagued them at Daytona 2 years earlier was now completely solved. Ferrari, the dominant force at Le Mans for years, was utterly crushed. Henry Ford II stood in victory lane that day with a smile that said everything. You can probably guess what happened next. Insurance companies noticed. Because suddenly, street versions of these engines were showing up in Cobras and Galaxies that could run the quarter mile in 11.2 seconds at over 125 miles per hour. 0 to 60 in under 4 seconds. Top speeds approaching 140 miles per hour on public roads. In 1967, insuring a high-performance Ford could cost over $3,000 a year, more than the car itself. Young drivers were being quoted premiums that exceeded their annual income. Insurance agents started refusing coverage entirely for certain models. Meanwhile, GM was scrambling. Chevrolet's new 396 big block was making around 375 horsepower in factory trim. The L72 427 would eventually reach 425. Pontiac pushed the 421 and developed the 428. Everyone was chasing the same goal, but the FE still revved higher, still made more torque, still dominated endurance racing. And behind closed doors, executives knew it. Because this wasn't just about winning races anymore. It was about reputation, sales, identity. The American performance market had become a battlefield, and engines were the weapons. Buyers were choosing brands based on who won on Sunday. Dealerships plastered racing victories across their showrooms. Magazine advertisements showed checkered flags and trophy presentations. By 1968, Ford had built fewer than 300 street-legal 427 side oilers. Each one cost nearly double the price of a standard FE engine at around $730 from the factory. They were hand-assembled, individually balanced, nearly race-ready from the crate. But emissions regulations were coming. The Clean Air Act loomed. High-compression engines were about to become extinct. Unleaded fuel requirements would kill anything running over 10:1 compression. Smog controls were being mandated. The muscle car era's days were numbered. Everyone in Detroit could see it coming. By the early 70s, production ended. Tooling was scrapped. Blocks were melted down. The war faded. But the legend didn't. Because by the 1990s, an original Cobra 427 powered by a genuine side oiler was selling for over $1 million at auction. Some examples exceeded $2 million. Collectors could identify authentic side oilers by the distinctive oil passage casting on the side of the block. Replicas flooded the market, but none had the original soul. Because that engine didn't just win Le Mans. It survived 24 hours at full throttle because of one simple idea. Feed the crank first, everything else second. And in doing so, it didn't just beat GM on the track. It forced them into a performance arms race that would define the muscle car era for decades. The 427 side oiler proved that Ford could engineer at GM's level, that they could compete, that they could win. And that pressure pushed both companies to build some of the most legendary engines in automotive history. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments what engine war you want to see next. And make sure to subscribe, because the next rivalry is already heating up.